Today we're looking at the new LZX Industries FKG3 Keyer. This Keyer is the first in the Generation 3 of LZX modules. It features a streamlined and efficient workflow and higher quality standards unlike anything seen before in an analog video module. While the interface is optimized for RGB workflows, it can still be used in non-RGB contexts. In addition to a new design aesthetic, the Generation 3 modules also feature center detents on certain knobs, very high quality pots and switches, and the rear of this module must be connected to sync. That is to ensure that these switches do not glitch when they're touched. This is a particularly cool improvement I'm very excited about. The FKG3 has 3 sets of inputs, a background, a foreground, and an external key. There's 1 set of RGB outputs, and 2 CVs for threshold and softness. The rotary switches provide a number of different states, the idea being that with 1 set of patches, you can access a large number of different variations. The FKG3 is the most fully featured keyer LZX has released to date, and in many ways it mimics the features found on broadcast switchers and video mixers. If you're used to that sort of keying, you'll be right at home with the FKG3. So let's patch it up and show you how it works. Here I have a short video clip playing off of the Memory Palace. It's going into the foreground input on the FKG3. Threshold and softness are at 0, source is set to foreground in the middle, and the mode is set to Luma key. As I start to adjust the threshold, you can see it start to key out the brighter parts of the image. So there goes my background, and there goes everything but the shirt. The softness control will change how hard or soft those edges are. When you go all the way to full softness, the unit works like a fader, fading between the foreground and background images. With nothing plugged in, the background image defaults to black. We also can invert the key. We can rectify the key, which will basically just select the outlines. Scan through some of those. Adjust the softness for a more dramatic effect. And we can also change the mode from keying Luma, which is looking at all 3 of the red, green, and blue channels, to just keying the red. So in this case, we'll just start to key out her skin. We could just key the green, which there isn't really much green in here, but there's a little bit in the shirt. Or we can key just the blue, which is going to give us the background. So let's set this all back. Of course, the real fun with the FKG3 comes with patching in multiple RGB sources. So now I'm going to patch an RGB output from the Fortress into the background. Now as we adjust the threshold, we get her laid over that nice Fortress background. Change this for a little more contrast. So now as we adjust the threshold and the softness, start to achieve a number of different things. And you'll see if we turn the softness all the way up, it starts to act more like a crossfader. Turn that down. We can invert it. And we can also start to play with the color channels. So if we go just to the green channel, start to just get her dress out there. If we adjust the hue a little bit more, start to do something like that. And of course, if we go to the blue channel, since it's mostly a blue background, we're going to get the cleanest key. And this is where you could use something like green screen footage and get a pretty nice clean green screen. If you play with the softness, you can kind of fine-tune how those edges go. And again, we can also invert the key, and we can also rectify the key. So with rectification, we'll just start to get those outlines, which is pretty neat. Now so far we've just been using the foreground as a key. We could also use the background image as a key. So now it's using the fortress to key out. So you could do just some wipes and get some different patterns. And you can also plug in to the third input for an external key. So I'm going to go from the external key, and I'm just going to take a circle ramp. I'll set my key source to external. And then as we go through the threshold, you'll get probably what you would expect. So now that circular ramp is keying the foreground over the background. I can again adjust the softness to get more of a soft vignette or a harder edge key. And again, you could switch through the RGB inputs. This isn't going to do too much because I don't have anything plugged into the G and B. But what is neat is that you can add together different sources. So I can take, say, some scrolling motion from a prismatic ray. And now this is going to add into my key source. So I can get that circle with a little bit of movement. Another option, of course, is using the threshold CV control. I could plug that in there, and then we can start to adjust the threshold based on the movement of this prismatic ray. And the control is bipolar. You can go positive or negative. And you can also CV the softness. So I'm going to go out from a diver. And so this will change the behavior. So it starts to act more like a crossfader in the areas where the diver is telling it to. And again, we can invert the key, we can rectify the key. And start to get a bunch of different effects. And you could still switch, so now we're switching back to the foreground key. In this case, the external key is largely being ignored. And we could switch to the background key. So now we have her sort of teleporting in and out. So that's a nice basic patch for using the FKG3 in the way that you might use a traditional broadcast switcher, to take one full-color RGB image and layer it over another full-color RGB image. The advantage to the FKG3 is that all of these things are patched out and you have CV control over your threshold and your softness. In the next example, we'll look at how you can use the FKG3 in a more abstract shape and pattern patch. In this example, I have a simple rotating shape from the memory palace going into a staircase to generate red, green, and blue colors using the color chords. This then goes into the FKG3. I'm using this setup because it's fairly simple to demonstrate what the FKG is going to be doing. But obviously, any way you have of making an RGB shape is going to work in this context. So again, you see as I adjust the threshold, I key out different parts of the shape. There's nothing plugged into the background, so it's currently going to be black. We can also key just the red, green, or blue portions of this image. So I'll set this back to Luma. Again, using the fortress, I'm going to plug in a background image. And so right away, you see with very minimal patching, we're getting a very clean A over B image composite. And of course I can invert this. And again, rectify. In the previous generation of modules, this type of simple A over B composite would have required several more modules costing much more money and using much more rack space. This type of efficiency is what the Generation 3 modules are all about. So one thing we can do to make this a little bit more interesting is start experimenting with some threshold CVs. So I can go from one of the Fortress outputs, start adjusting this threshold. Maybe bring this down a little bit so you can see what we're doing. Zoom in on this guy a bit. And so now you can see those bars from the Fortress are starting to interact with the key, which is always a cool thing. We could also set the key mode to the background and try taking that same threshold control from our memory palace, so essentially doing the opposite. So we can get these very cool interrelated keys and still maintain a full RGB output. Now let's go back to our basic A over B. We could start to get a totally unrelated threshold. So I'm going to go from a diver. So now the diver is adding that vertical motion. If we want, we can add a little bit of modulation into the Fortress. And then switching through the red, green, and blue keys, I'm going to get pretty different results. And you'll notice when I switch, there's no glitching on the screen. This is why we have those sync inputs on the back. And we could take another output from Fortress, put that into the softness CV. So we start to get things getting a little more complex and a little more interrelated. There we go. And you could start to play with your color palettes here. Because I'm using the Luma key, it's not going to interact too much. But if I switch to the red, bringing up the red levels of these different parts of the image is going to affect how it's keying. And maybe I can get some feedback going on here. There we go. Again, we can start to play with these different keying thresholds. Switch this back to pure Luma. And then of course we can also bring in a totally external key. So I'm going to come out from the prismatic ray, go into my external key, the source to external. So you can see here I have some horizontal scrolling bars. Because we're using this external key and we're only using the red input, we can start to plug some other things in. So I'm just going to take some random stuff from around the patch, go into all these external keys, and then we start to get something a lot more complicated. So playing with that same patch for a little bit, came up with this. And in a previous generation LZX system, you would need a marble index, several doorways, and a visual cortex to get anywhere near this level of color compositing. The FKG3 takes a number of compositing operations and streamlines them into an efficient and tidy workflow. Next, we'll look at a more unusual application for the FKG. While the FKG3 is optimized for RGB workflows, that doesn't mean you can't use it in other contexts. In this next example, we'll use it to key 3 separate modulation sources. So for my image here, I just have some basic bars coming from the prismatic ray into the staircase. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take 3 different outputs from my pendulum. And I'm going to put those into the foreground inputs on my FKG3. These outputs I'll now take into a few different destinations. So I'll go in the pedestal, into multiply, voltage control. I'll keep these all down at 0. And let's go into the frequency control on the staircase. I'm going to 0 out everything here. So if I set my source to foreground, we'll start to see some of that pendulum action coming through and influencing those various destinations. But here, adjusting my threshold isn't going to do a whole lot. It's not going to get super interesting because this is looking for an image to key. Keying over time can do some neat things, but it's not super interesting. So let's put in a circle ramp from my visual cortex. Let's set the source to external. And then as we go through our threshold controls, you'll start to see that circle letting the modulation through only in a specific area. So now when I adjust my pedestals and my multiply BC, we could start to get that modulation only occurring inside the circle. And I can play with inversions, and again rectifying. Get some pretty cool stuff. Obviously I could add some animation to this circle, but that's not really the point of this video, so we'll kind of leave it where it is. And just adjust some different things. And now of course you can also bring different modulation sources into the background. So I'm going to take some outputs from Diver. Maybe an output from Fortress. And why not do one from the Memory Palace as well? So now our background area is giving us that very complex modulation. And our foreground circle is just those simple things coming from the pendulum. And I can adjust my softness to act as more of a crossfader. And I could put a softness CV, maybe use a different ramp. Maybe use a vertical ramp in here. And I could also, instead of modulating the softness, modulate the threshold of that key. Let's move that to something a little bit more interesting down here. There we go. So in addition to a standard RGB keying workflow, you can also use FKG3 to key your modulation sources, or anything else inside your system. So even though the FKG3 is designed for one very specific workflow, it still at its heart is a combination of simple function blocks. With a little imagination, you can use it in a number of different ways. As the first Generation 3 module, the FKG3 sets a new high watermark for quality and efficiency in the LZX system. As the new modules start to roll out, you'll start to see that you can do a ton more in a much smaller space. At the same time, they don't make the previous generations of modules obsolete. The simpler function blocks of the Expedition and Visionary series still work great with the Generation 3 modules. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please leave any questions in the comments below, And as always, thanks for watching.